That's some outfit you got on.
We want the Kreitz.
Oh, really? Who are they? Some new team?
The Kreitz.
For this first ever episode, we're going to go back to where horror films all started for me, the 1986 comedy sci-fi horror film, Critters. Welcome to this first episode of Insidicast, and I am going to be your host, the Insidicaster, I guess, Phil. This is my podcast that I've started to talk about, discuss, review all the best horror films that have been influential, not only in my life, but also in other people's. This episode is purely an introduction to who I am, where this all started, and why I love horror films so much. Of course, we can't start this off without talking about where this all started for me, which was Critters, released in 1986, follows the Brown family living on a picturesque farm in rural Kansas, who are unlucky enough to be living next to the crash site of escaped alien prisoners known as the Kreitz. Minutes behind them, of course, are the two bounty hunters sent from the high-security prison asteroid Sector 17 to eliminate the Kreitz with their evidence for money, whilst also trying their best to not leave a path of destruction in their wake. The Brown family consists of husband and wife Jay and Helen, and their two children Bradley and April, and not forgetting their cat Chewy. The farmhand Charlie, obsessed with alien invasions similar to Roswell, references are plentiful in this film in relations with Russian spies. Bradley, however, is in many ways the main protagonist of this film, with the central plots revolve around him and his family acting as influences into his hero story. He is caught between ensuring the survival of his family and alerting the town's police, something that eventually aligns himself within the destructive path of the two bounty hunters, and luckily for Bradley, he is basically the embodiment of Dennis the Menace, who wields a slingshot and firecrackers. Let's be honest, they're more practically homemade explosives, which later become the key in defeating the Kreitz, saving his family and earning respect of the bounty hunters, who, by the way, end up, I guess, taking credit and payment for Bradley's hard work in defeating the Kreitz as he blows up the ship. So I had to rewatch this film. I haven't watched this in many years, and I have to admit, it was a lot better than I expected. I think the preconceived notions, I guess, from what happened with the sequels, really don't do justice for the first Critters film. The first Critters film does try its hardest to take itself seriously, to take the situation seriously, and to treat the cast with some relatively good respect. And to be fair, the acting in this film is solid. I think it carries a lot of the film, especially in some areas where the plot is a little bit weak. And there's obviously great classic people in here, such as Lin Shaye, very popular screen queen, I guess, at this point, and always manages to find her way into many horror films, including Insidious, influenced by the name of this podcast. And it was pretty crazy seeing her as a younger self in a different role that isn't just trying to exorcise demons. She's just sort of, I guess, like the police secretary. It's nice to see them, nice to see some returning faces, such as Emmett Walsh, who plays Harv, who's the sheriff. Generally pretty well-known actor. He tends to play a lot of like typical American, characters that you really need in shows and films and media. Outside of this, I don't particularly recognize anyone else in any of the films, and I can't really recognize any of the films that I've seen them in. Not to say that they haven't been in films, I just haven't personally seen any of the films with them in them. Rewatching this film has been pretty interesting, actually. The first thing that I really wanted to rewatch again, it was one of the most striking parts of the film that I always remember being younger, which was the face changing of the bounty hunters. As when I was younger, when I watched this, had no idea how they did this. It absolutely blew my mind. It was also so creepy watching the skull fill up with blood. Like, that was the first time I've ever seen anything like that, and I didn't know that type of stuff was even possible in films. But I can see now how it was done. It's basically just waxwork. You sort of melt something else, and then play one of them in reverse, and you sort of see this like transition between a face melting and then reforming. Done very recently as well in Possessor, which was released in 2020. Very, very good film. Same kind of thing with the waxwork in terms of watching one person switch from one body to another. Same kind of deal. They sort of melt a face and then reform a face. It's a very good like visual storytelling, and I think this is one thing that Critters does, which doesn't get a lot of credit actually. For a lot of people from rewatching this stuff, which is it really does rely on showing and not telling the audience. You know, compared this to, I guess, the film that it's going to get compared to the most is The Gremlins. You know, in The Gremlins, it kind of gets told, don't get them wet, don't feed them after midnight, you know, don't do this, don't do that. You know, outside of like where they come from, that's a lot of the plot kind of given to you right then and there, right? Because they're going to get wet, they're going to get fed after midnight, you're going to see what happens when you do this. In Critters, however, there really isn't a lot of telling for the audience. You know that these people have escaped. You know that it's a high maximum security prison. But outside of that, you don't know what their purpose is except to eat. You don't know why they eat. You don't know why they grow when they eat. You don't know why particularly they will eat things that aren't like meat, I guess, or like flesh. There's no particular motive outside of that. There's a lot of things that are left to the audience to fill in the gaps, and this gets replicated a lot in the filmmaking as well. One of the things that I really appreciate this film, compared to many films of its time back in the day, it definitely relies a lot on shadows to give you the element of mystery, and that's something that's kind of lacking a lot in horror films today, because generally there's a lot of big set pieces. They're usually really well lit because they have really good cameras. You don't want to like be spending thousands and thousands of pounds on cameras to just film things in the dark where you can't see anything. You know, you want to see the actors well lit. The actors themselves probably want to be well lit and seen in the film, especially if it's like a successful franchise. So a lot of the craft that kind of goes into like 80s horror films is kind of like lost in a way where like they used shadows and the dark a lot to hide away a lot of the details that they don't want you to see. And when you compare this to other films of its type, like Gremlins, or you could say like Puppet Master or Ghoulies or anything like that, you know, they're generally, from what I remember, pretty well lit films. A lot of the stuff is done in the daytime. You can sort of know that they are puppets. And I guess in many ways, they probably spent a lot of time in designing these puppets and making them look good, that they want them to be seen. Whereas the Critters, and the Krites specifically, you know, they're more than happy to hide in the dark. They don't want to show you all that detail. There's not a lot of detail there anyway. This kind of heightens a lot of the horror in many ways, because they're just little black, fluffy balls rolling around in the dark. You know, you don't know where they're going to pop out and when. They're going to ambush you. They're going to, you know, go at your ankles. They'll do whatever. And of course, as things develop later in the plot and the Krites eat more and get bigger, you know, they still stick to showing and not telling. You know, they want to show you what it looks like, but also obscure it just enough for your mind to fill in the blanks. And of course, that's where like a lot of horror came from for a lot of people back in, you know, the 80s, where we didn't have like massive amounts of visual effects, where we can literally show you everything in hyper detail of, you know, what's happened to these people or what these creatures look like, you know, or what the gore looks like. A lot of it you had to do through suggestion and sort of clever camera work, especially because a lot of horror films were generally quite low budget. They didn't have massive amounts of funding and set pieces to do like a massive, like elaborate sequence with aliens. So because of that, a lot of it had to be like sleight of hand. But in many ways, that makes them successful, and so it gives them a lot of charm. And I think that's something that like gives Critters a lot of credit, where people probably wouldn't give it a lot of credit because of the time that it came out and because of the scene that it was getting into, the small creature features. But absolutely amazing to rewatch this again. Truly, truly did enjoy it. Of course, now I'm going to go over some more of like little details that I've noticed and some of the parts of the plot that are really important to me. Following on to the points I was making earlier about sort of the hiding and the suggestion, the reveal of the Krites in this film I totally forgot about this, is pretty hilarious, actually. So the father, Jay, he goes into the basement because this is where the phone line is. And when the phone line gets cut, this is quite an integral part, I think. This is kind of where it shifts away from the sort of picturesque, highly contrasted, highly colourful Kansas farm, very much like the Wizard of Oz kind of thing, where the tone shifts massively. And they go into the basement and then they realise that there's this fluffy thing amongst the teddies that are moving. And it's hard to tell whether, like, it's stroking it or if it's humping it. Like, I don't know what, like, the process of what this critter was doing, but he gets ambushed. He gets bitten quite heavily in multiple places, and he also gets stung by the little, I guess, like, venom darts, which is kind of funny. Like, kind of reminds you of, like, a hedgehog or a skunk, or maybe not a skunk, kind of like a hedgehog. And I think a lot of animals have this type of thing in nature anyway. They kind of, like, poison you with some kind of dart and, you're sort of immobilized. A lot of animals have, like, venom. So it's kind of cool that they can pull from nature to give you some influence. Again, it just kind of, I think these, like, subtle things just sort of elevate the film a little bit more from, like, the trash tier that a lot of people might place these films in compared to other films that came out in the 80s, which were huge hits. I mean, this could have been equally huge back then. I wasn't alive, so I can't really tell, but I'm just making, like, general assumptions. And of course, he gets bitten, and I think this is also the point where the plot really switches over to Bradley, because Jay is essentially the father. Jay is the protector of the family, and he's pretty much taken out straight away. And of course, by taken out, I don't mean, like, he's dead. I just mean, like, he's injured and he's sort of dozed by the venom in this little fang thing that gets shot. So it then just sort of comes on to Bradley to be the savior of the house, and Jay becomes this authority figure who gives him the permission to take these steps and to basically defend the family. Of course, whilst all this has been happening, pretty typical of its time, April, the sister, who has very little to do in this film, it's quite a shame. I feel like she is just designated the damsel in distress. She just spends this whole time making out with a boyfriend in the sort of barn that they have in the hay, which, by the way, he says he's allergic to hay, and he spent, like, all of this time just rolling around in it. Like, I would be dead, genuinely. And of course, they get interrupted by the Kreitz, and that's when she realizes what's going on, and her boyfriend loses his fingers. It's all very dramatic. And then they sort of meet up with the family, and then it becomes more of a family drama where they're all stuck together. Whilst all this is happening, the bounty hunters have made it to town, and they are looking for the Kreitz, and they will do anything to find the Kreitz. They will ask anybody and, impose their leathery goodness onto people and their big cannons in very, like, big sci-fi energy, very big 80s energy, huge. Obviously, the main one is impersonating someone called Johnny Steele, who is a supposed rock star in this world. And he gets some kind of recognition from various people in town who know who he is because they play his music a few times throughout the film. And they go to building, trying to find the Kreitz, causing a little bit of destruction, trying their best to not completely destroy the planet. And then there's a very, very bizarre scene where they turn up at the church. And when they turn up at this church, the pastor, who eventually becomes one of the swapped faces for the second bounty hunter, he talks about Genesis 19. And I didn't know this when I first watched this film, so I was wondering if there was anything kind of substantial about Genesis 19 and if I should check out the quote and see what was going on. So I did. And generally, it's kind of summed up as, like, 2 angels come to Sodom to destroy the city, which I guess you could say is, like, the bounty hunters. And then Lot greets them at the city, insisting that they stay at his house for the night, which you could say could be Bradley, saying, "Go to my house, this is where the Kreitz are." And then based on what happens in the next few verses, Lot likely knows that the traveling strangers will not be safe in the streets in the same way the bounty hunters probably won't be safe looking around the streets all the time, shooting, blowing things up. Eventually, people are going to start shooting at them. It's going to be pretty chaotic. So there was some kind of, like, parallels, I guess, to this verse. But then, obviously, the actual Genesis 19 goes on about, like, incest and, like we can't have babies, so we should have sex with our father. Don't know what that's all about. It has nothing to do with the film. I don't know if it was just like a very loose connection, or it was just some random thing that the writer decided to throw in there for the fun of it. But as far as I can see, there's very, very loose sort of references of what's actually going on in this film. It doesn't really have any bigger meaning outside of that, which is a shame. I was hoping it did, but it definitely didn't. And obviously when they come, a lot of the other tonal parts of the film shift. It definitely becomes more of like almost like a Terminator type deal, where they're sort of running around trying to find the other person to kill and destroy them. And it's kind of cool to see that on a lesser scale of like the Terminator. It's slightly less world ending. Kind of seems like the Krites just could leave whenever they want to because they don't care. They just sort of come for food and then they just move on. And they kind of make a point anyway when they're on the prison planet that they have more than enough fuel to go around the entire like universe 10 times or something. So they're just kind of joyriding at this point. So I don't think they really intend to stay here and cause a lot of drama. So not quite as high stakes. One of the other parts of the film that stuck with me forever was just before the lights go out. We see the eyes of the critters coming back through the window outside as Helen looks outside doing the dishes. And something about that has stuck with me for the longest time, and I think that was one of the first times like something in a film has like scared me to the point where like it affects my daily life. Like outside of this, it was probably The Grudge. And it was crazy seeing just how simple that is, but effective, you know. And now when you think about like, you could be next in your kitchen at night, you know, you're looking out, the light is just slightly obscuring what's happening outside, and there could just be a pair of eyes looking back at you. You know, subtle, like, small things like this in film have so much more, like, bigger impact, I think, than some of the huge set pieces where they're trying to scare you, you know. And I think this shows what this film tries to do a lot. It tries to rely on the more subtle natures of what is happening and what they have to work with to kind of imply more seriousness and imply more danger than there actually is, and imply more horror than there actually is. Because outside of that, really, it is just the family running around. It is just the bounty hunters running around trying to find the family. There's a lot of wait and build up to the finale. And of course, the finale is one of the best parts because I think a lot of people get a really good payoff in the finale. Before I go on to the finale, just want to talk about a few other little things that I noticed in this film that is really crazy to look back on now because I had no idea this stuff when I was younger. One, Jay, the father, he's obviously part of this like bowling club, which is part of the place where the bounty hunters go to find them. And this is where they find Charlie. And Charlie tries to take them to where the farm actually is, but he can't catch up with them because he's on a bike and in a car. But anyway, and the logo of the bowling club looks exactly like the Ghostbusters logo, except it's a bowling pin and not a ghost. And it's just hilarious. Like, I had no idea that that was the case back then. And you look at it now and you think these films are only a few years apart from each other. It's just another one of those little like Easter eggs they've thrown in there. The same with the Krites looking at a little teddy sort of thing that Bradley has, which is of like a very makeshift non-copyright version of E.T., you know, and the Krites are just like, who are you? And like just staring at this E.T. that just doesn't respond. And then the Krites just like, just eat it, just like rip it into pieces, and it's just fluff everywhere. Few elements of like gold like that amongst a film that kind of really doesn't have a lot going on outside these moments. But one thing I think people don't think about when it comes to the first film is that it's actually not as funny as the later sequels, or rather it doesn't try as hard to be funny. The comedy in this film is actually really subtle. You're talking like a few one-liners every now and then, and you're talking like a few intended punchline jokes. But outside of that, like, it's very serious. And like I said at the start of this, like, the film tries its best to take itself seriously and to say, you know, this is a real film. We're really trying to do this. This isn't just like some throwaway gimmick where we can just throw some puppets around. Like, they want to incite horror. They want to incite some kind of plot and story and have like a finished product by the end of it. It's not perfect. I'm going to talk about some of the issues real quick, but it definitely tries, you know. I think what I'll do is I'll sum up sort of the good and the bad points together so that I'm just not like berating with negative parts of the film. But there's some things that definitely work, and there's some things that definitely don't work in this film. The things that I think work for sure is one, having Jay, the father, taken out quite early. I think this is good to have some more of the tension by having sort of the big macho dad taken out, and then things sort of relied on the more weaker parts of the family, like the children, to have to like try and save the day. Things that didn't kind of work was Helen, the wife. She sort of had this weird personality split throughout the film, where sometimes she would be like this complete emotional wreck who is like, where's Bradley? What's happening? Crying, that kind of thing. And then she would like turn into a clone of Ripley, where she's like wielding the shotgun. She kills 2 of them, by the way, which is more than I think most of the bounty hunters in this film. And what's kind of weird about this is she never really sticks to this role. It just becomes a part of the plot. So she will shoot things so that the family can get to a safer place. But it's kind of funny seeing her like when they run out of shells, and she's just like, oh, like really disappointed that she can't just go and blow more up. I think it'd be kind of interesting to just see her run around with a shotgun, to be honest. But yeah, I think like to have that and then to go back to sort of like, I'm just going to cry in the car and not really do anything is just kind of weird. It makes it feel a bit less like she's a real human and more like, okay, we need you to do this for the plot now, and then we need you to do this for the plot now. And, you know, there's no like consistency of the character. I think most of the character is centered around building up Bradley. You know, what she does do though that's good is she has that concerned, compassionate mother element of the film, which adds more stakes to Bradley. It makes you care more about Bradley's safety because she cares about Bradley's safety. She probably does more than anyone else because the dad doesn't really say that much. The dad actually like encourages him to get more in danger, and the sister is just bored of the whole situation. April for me just did not work in this film at all. She literally did nothing, and I said it earlier, I think it's kind of a shame really, but outside of just being for the most part bored throughout this film, like you could visibly see that she's bored, the way she's just lying on the bed like, can't wait for this to be over. You know, but also like she just becomes the damsel in distress at the end. You know, the reason that they even know where the ship is because they take her there, and even then there's no real clear way that you know that that's how they found out where the ship is. They just figured out that's where April is, and then they just go to it. But yeah, she didn't work as a character, unfortunately, and it's kind of a shame. I wish she had more to do than just roll around in the hay making out, then being a little bit emotional, and then sort of just being bored of the whole thing. Charlie, pretty fun part of the film. He is sort of this innocent, drunk slash, you know, boy who cried wolf kind of persona, you know, with a little bit of naivety in there as well. Still manages to achieve some type of arc within the film. I don't think this is really fleshed out as much as it could have been, but they definitely had something there. I think when he threw the bottle into the ship to blow up the big firecracker, well, let's be honest, it's basically a homemade explosive. I don't know how Bradley gets away with essentially creating dynamite on a farm. I don't know what with, but it's pretty crazy. Charlie now throws this away because he sees like a bigger purpose in the world. You know, he wants to be the bounty hunters, the people who are actually aliens and people who will actually believe everything that he says and everything that he believes. And Charlie's had sort of various moments in this film where, you know, he is a bit hopeless because he believes these things are real. He can feel it in his feelings, but no one believes him. Kind of an interesting thing as well that he talks about a story about seeing aliens with orange heads, and obviously when the bounty hunters come, they have green heads. So I don't know if they're sort of somehow related as a part of the story. They never go into it though. But he has like a mild arc, but they don't really go into it deep enough to be like, you know, this is the massive turning point for Charlie. This is me like giving it more credit than it probably has at the moment. Finally, to wrap this up, because I don't really want this to be too long. This is just an introduction. This is just talking about one of the films that really makes a big impression on me and means a lot to me, and something I haven't seen in years, but I needed to refresh myself with this because, you know, although other things have come out since, there's still special and magical things that happen in Critters that kind of make it a little bit more than I think what a lot of people thought it was going to be. And I think the things that make it special to me is the kitchen scene with the growing red eyes. I think that definitely terrified me a lot. The face changing scene was 100% mind blowing at the time for me. I think what Critters benefits from, like many films in the 80s really, is really good practical effects, some nice practical makeup. Some were a little bit better than others, but like they tried. The puppetry was pretty good. Like it didn't look fake, you know. The shadows helped making the big one just not look like a guy in a suit, so that was pretty good. You know, and relatively the story was okay. I think what this film does benefit from is some of the fear of the unknown and the things that allow your mind to fill in the blanks by using shadows and using, you know, more suggestion than sort of having everything really brightly lit, you know. And that's something that separates it from other films of its genre that are around the same time. But it's not perfect. But they try to make it more than just being tiny fluffy balls with teeth. They try and get you to use more of the legwork by filling in the blanks with your own mind and making them out to be more of a threat than they otherwise would appear to be if everything was brightly lit and it was in the daytime. Which I think is probably where the sequel failed. I can't quite remember the sequel, but I think a lot of that film was set in the daytime and the Critters was attacking in the daytime, and they relied a lot more on the comedy. I think the sequel was still not as bad as some of the later installments, but it was still, like, as many horror films are, sort of a victim on the sequel. They sort of, you know, have a hard time justifying why it should exist, especially if, like, the first film does a pretty decent job at setting out what it was trying to do. So this is sort of my summary of Critters. I think as a final verdict, I would give it a 3 out of 5. You know, I think it was a lot better than it was when I was younger. Obviously, it's nowhere near perfect, but there is some charm for it for me and some nostalgia for me, so it's probably higher than a lot of people would rate it. But let me know what you think. This is going to be the first episode. Bit of an intro, bit of a review of a film as well. My intention is that outside of this, I am going to focus on content with other people. I'm going to bring on friends I know, people that I know who are really into horror films, and talk about where horror started for them and what films inspired them to get into horror and watch more horror films. Outside of this, I'll be running an Instagram page. On there, I'll be providing some little snippets of the episode along with any other topics I want to bring up, including like polls, or we can have discussions in the comments and stuff. Potentially, possibility, maybe working on a YouTube page, depending on how that goes. I kind of intend on this just being a podcast. I may put the podcast on the YouTube, however. We can have some discussions on there. It's a little bit better to talk to people. And then maybe, depending on how much additional spare content I have left over and have to edit out in the future, I can run a Patreon if people are interested in that, where I can upload unedited cuts of podcasts, and we can think of some other nice content to throw on there as well. For now, this is just a long-term plan. I just wanted to throw something out there to get the ball rolling, get the ball started, so you get to see the podcast and get to hear me and what I'm interested in. And I look forward to, hopefully, having a good conversation with people about this in the future. For now, this has been Insidicast. I've been the host, Phil, and I hope you all have a good one.